Well, good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are and what time zone you're on. We'd like to officially welcome all of you to the Physical Education in the Future webinar sponsored by the Michigan Fitness Foundation and Fizika Group. We've got a great lineup of presentations tonight, and before we get started, we just wanted to make a few housekeeping notes. As you can see, your microphones are muted. That is to minimize the amount of feedback or reverberation that might occur. This webinar is being recorded. We have a number of colleagues who have asked us to archive the presentation, so it will be available at a later date on the Fizika Group website and the Michigan Fitness Foundation website, and probably the PE Links for You website. Right, Steve? Again, my name is Martha Harris, and let me introduce the other speakers on this call today. My name is Martha Harris, and along with Michael Cordier, I started a company called Fizika Group 4 years ago because of a shared concern that Michael and I had that health and physical education was not getting its full due in America. Funds were being cut, positions were being eliminated, and PE wasn't being offered. Where PE existed, it was sporadic and not widely available so that all students could apply their physical capabilities for future lifetime of healthy physical activity. We're delighted to be a partner with the Michigan Fitness Foundation, where we work closely with Dr. Kokinakis and her colleagues to help them share their good products around the U.S. and around the world. I'd like my fellow speakers to say a quick word of introduction, starting with Steve, Jefferies. Welcome.
Hi Martha, hi everybody. Just wanted to thank you and Lee for inviting me to be a part of the webinar, and I've looked through the list of folks who signed up to participate, and certainly we've got an impressive group of people, and I look forward to having you contribute to the session too with questions and thoughts, but it should be fun. Thanks.
Thank you, and Lee, please say a few words of welcome to our group.
Good evening or good afternoon. Glad to be part of this opportunity to talk about physical education and the future. And thanks to Martha and Steve for joining in this important conversation.
Thank you. What we want to accomplish in this webinar is Steve will lead us through a very good discussion of why physical education is important. We will introduce the concept of physical literacy and what that means for the future of physical education in America, following the pattern of other countries that have adopted physical literacy as their overarching objective. Lee will guide us through a discussion of physical education outcomes, how important they are for improving the accountability and the replicability of physical education in schools. And then finally we'll close with Steve's discussion of a changing future of physical education. We'd ask, in the interest of time, since we do have a full hour of material, that you hold your questions until the end. You'll see in your GoToMeeting control panel, you can offer a question, you can raise your hand, and then you can put your question in what looks like a chat box, and we will be looking at those through the course of the hour. John Seville, my colleague from Fizika Group, will help identify those questions and where they should be directed if it's not identified and when you submit the question. So with no further ado, let's get started. Steve, why is physical education important?
Thanks. I want to begin by sharing a few thoughts as to why physical education and physical education teaching is important. Rather than list all the benefits that most of us are already familiar with, I'm going to focus on what I think is at the core of what physical education is all about. As you know, today's world is changing at an incredible pace, and it's both an exciting and challenging time for us in physical education. But some things remain unchanged, and they haven't changed for thousands of years. Human beings still need to move to stay healthy and to be able to lead happy and productive lives. In fact, with all of the technological advances that we've seen in the past century or so, it's become even more important for us to move, but especially to help growing youngsters develop healthy bodies, because we can see the terrible personal and societal consequences of poor health. But I think that the growing urgency to get people, and especially children, moving. Oops, we've jumped a slide there.
Sorry.
And next slide. Okay, a slide's gone out. The urgency to get people moving, and especially children, can lead to some very narrow-minded strategic thinking. It seems to me that children and young people actually spend very little time thinking about their health or the future consequences if they aren't physically active or eat well. They're unlikely to be motivated by messages that implore them to be physically active because it's good for their bodies and will help prevent bad things happening to them later in life. Instead, I see things differently. Beginning at birth, movement is the way in which children learn and something that brings joy to their lives. They want to do it, and they simply don't need any adult encouragement. So, if we as adults want children to continue to be physically active, I think we need to focus on what's going to motivate them to want to stay physically active and set aside our adult fears about poor health. How should we as adults do this? Well, it's really no secret. All of us tend to persist in doing things that we enjoy. And what this means to me is that physical education's role in the future is not just getting kids to be physically active, but even more importantly, helping to make sure that they enjoy movement and want to do it even when we're not there to urge them on, which of course is most of the time. To me, this distinction is very important because today there's a great deal of interest in reducing obesity and mounting public awareness of the need to get kids more active. But simply doing physical activity to children is in many ways a coercive approach that I don't think in the long run is going to be very effective. Instead, I think physical education's role should focus on getting kids motivated to move. And it's this role that I see very distinct from simply getting kids moving, which is the main message of many health-fixated physical activity advocates. For us as a nation to succeed in positively affecting the lives of the 50 million children in our public schools, we need to be careful to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach. Our focus has to be on preparing our children with the skills, knowledge, and motivation to want to seek out opportunities to be physically active. And these types of experiences can only be provided by professionally trained adults who have the opportunity to mentor children. And these, of course, are school-based physical education teachers. However, for us to succeed, we certainly need to do a much better job of educating the public as to this critical role that we play in the lives of children, and most importantly, pointing out how physical education is very different from simply providing organized physical activity breaks in schools. So we're going to go on now just looking at a little bit of background as to the standards, and let me jump back to what I think was a very important event that occurred in 1986, when we made a huge breakthrough, when the NASP Outcomes Committee developed a definition of what a physically educated person was. The 5 focus areas in the definition clearly identified what physical educators and PE programs should be doing for children. And the great thing was that it gave all of us some clear and consistent terminology to use when talking with one another, and probably more importantly to use when talking to those outside of our profession about the purpose of physical education. Before this, there was very little consistency and a pretty poor understanding of the purpose of PE programs in schools. So this definition was a breakthrough that I'm not even sure to this day many of us fully appreciate. And of course, it was based on this definition that NASP developed national standards, which were another positive initiative because it made us consistent with other school subject areas that were also guided by national standards. And so now, many years later, a new NASP committee recently examined our national standards and recommended some changes. And although I wasn't personally involved in the development of these new standards, I do have two observations to share. First, and what you have here is the first part of these new standards. It doesn't actually list the standards, but when you look at the new standards, you'll see that it first of all includes the almost identical original wording of what constitutes a physically educated person. And I was really pleased to see that, because to me, and certainly to the people I talk with and teach, it's a pretty easy to remember summary of the purposes of physical education. So I thought that was a very positive change with these new standards. Second, the word literate has replaced the word educated in this definition. And you'll notice there in the first line there, the goal of physical education is to develop physically literate individuals. And as you look at the standards, you'll see that the words physically literate has replaced physically educated. And I'm going to switch over. I think, Martha, you're going to continue from here.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for providing that background, particularly on the physical literacy and the evolution of the national standards. There have been many professionals, many of whom are on this call, who were involved in the development of those standards. So we wanted to thank you for their leadership, for your prior involvement, Steve. And we think we're really at an important tipping point when it comes to the future of physical education in America. By adopting physical literacy as the new overarching objective, it puts physical education on a par with other required subjects such as math and English and reading that require forms of literacy. And it opens the door for well-trained physical education professionals to become colleagues with their teachers of other disciplines, to work collaboratively to reinforce learning through movement that can help improve math, reading, English literacy skills, as well as to build the physical literacy of the person. We have a brief poll prepared to get a sense from our audience how many folks are familiar with the concepts of physical literacy as captured in the new standards, or perhaps through your other work. So bear with me while I pull up the poll. And if that's not going to happen, then we will go to a different view. But I think the goal, really what we're trying to establish through this webinar, is a broader understanding of how physical education is changing here in the United States. And one way to look at that is to look abroad at where the concept of physical literacy first began. We look to a very prominent researcher in the United Kingdom, Dr. Margaret Whitehead, who is given credit on a global basis for first coining the term or the concept of physical literacy. She's leading a global conversation to this day through her website, physicalliteracy.org.uk. And a definition that I've captured here is that physical literacy is the motivation, confidence, physical competence, understanding and knowledge to maintain physical activity at an individually appropriate level throughout life. So that the goal of a quality physical education program as redefined through these new standards is to equip all students with the appropriate skills, knowledge, and interest to be physically active through appropriate activities as their body ages over their lifetime. A very exciting concept. In the United Kingdom alone, which has embraced physical literacy for over 20 years, it's transformed the way they approach physical education. It becomes an inclusive activity, not just for those who are athletically inclined, but everyone who has a physical body can learn how to move that body in healthful and graceful ways with confidence over time. How do we get there? How do we attain that ideal state of physically literate adult population? It requires quality physical education. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Lee Kokinakis, who will guide us through the evolution of EPIC, the Exemplary Physical Education Program, which was designed initially to meet the NASP standards and is still highly relevant today under the new standards. So with that, let me pull up Lee so that she can join in this conversation and open her mic.
Thank you, Martha and Steve. Before I provide an overview of the exemplary physical education curriculum's role in achieving physical literacy, let me say that the social mission of the Michigan Fitness Foundation is at the core of the work that we do. That mission is to improve lives and strengthen communities by helping people eat healthy and be physically active across the lifespan. EPIC Classic was developed by MFF in cooperation with the Michigan Departments of Education and Community Health and a state consortium of universities, colleges, and schools. Those leaders cared then and still care passionately about all learners having equal access to excellent physical education teachers, materials, and procedures. Because we believe that quality K-12 physical education provides this equal access to optimum growth and development for all children, we strongly support physical education, quality physical education in our school settings. And we also believe that physical education is not only a class, it is not only a course. We think of it as a system and process, and we need physical education professionals who are committed to leading this view of physical education across the lifespan. Physical literacy outcomes pave the way for joy and satisfaction in a variety of physical activities over the lifetime. The faces of enjoyment and accomplishment do not look the same. The presenters in this webinar agree that joy matters. Choice is everywhere in today's world. Choosing to move, moving safely, moving in cooperation with others, moving across the lifespan. If it isn't satisfying, joyful in some way, it is much less likely to happen. One of the things I quickly was reminded of in returning to work with EPIC, and if you read my bio, you know that I was one of the original development team, but I've been away doing other things here at the foundation. In returning to work with EPIC, I am again reminded that aligned instruction, practice, and assessment are the gold standard in education. I thought in those early days in working on the project that physical education teachers using EPIC should provide in-service to non-PE teachers in their buildings. So strong was their mastery of good teaching and learning principles. With the emphasis in the education environment on instruction aligned with assessment, accountability, as Martha mentioned it, this is true today as well. EPIC Classic was developed as a set of interrelated instructional resources and suggested procedures to achieve the pillars of what we're now calling physical literacy: motor skill development, object control skills, fitness skills, knowledge and motivation, personal and social skills, and the confidence to be active for life. As we know, national standards guide the discipline of physical education, and EPIC has and continues to align with these standards. The graphic on your screen illustrates how EPIC K-5 content aligns with both the new on your right and old on your left national standards. The cornerstone to the EPIC Classic Roadmap to Learner Outcomes is the teaching learning progression. All of the content, the graphics illustrating the steps in the progression, the keywords, and grade level benchmarks are found in the 1 to 2 page teaching learning progression resource, 1 to 2 pages at K-5 levels. For our 612 materials, the teaching learning progression is much longer and is a complete compendium of information. A second essential component is clear instruction aligned with each step in the progression and the easy-to-remember cue words that emphasize key points and streamline the essential feedback that teachers know is needed and learners benefit from so much. A third cornerstone is the rich and fun reinforcing activities provided for each step in the progression to increase the physical activity and practice time for students to develop the competence on whatever that objective is. Most of these reinforcing activities also reinforce My Plate in the 2010 National Nutrition Guidelines for Americans. A fourth essential component and a keystone of EPIC are the assessments and grade level target benchmarks. Now, with the national standards emphasizing grade level outcomes, the value of using a curriculum that provides instruction and practice to achieve grade level targets is immense. So just to review these components on your screen, EPIC Classic users have options. For less detail, the teaching learning progression is a succinct summary, very complete summary of using the material. Grade level outcomes use aligned instruction, practice. Grade level outcome goals suggest using the aligned instruction, practice, and assessments as laid out in the detailed scope and sequence available for each grade, or the appropriate modifications. A comprehensive program at K-5 is desired. All K-5 objectives are available. Or individual objectives are now also available in cases where that's useful in a program. The EPIC K-5 curriculum was designed for classes that meet 2 periods per week for 30 minutes per period based on a 36 to 40 week school year. 35 was the number of objectives that could be covered using this equation. And the EPIC Classic objectives were selected to align with the national definition of a physically educated person by a large, about 200 stakeholder group who gave input on priorities. As I mentioned, and I'll mention again, the transparent, well-structured scope and sequence map can be easily modified for more or less periods per week if programs have more or less time. So the allocation of time to core content of EPIC results in 25% of the time of this particular twice a week 30-minute per period scenario to be used for other priorities locally. There's flexibility in using both the EPIC K-5 core content and providing instruction aligned with grade level benchmarks, as well as knowing that there is 25% of available time for local priorities. But flexibility is there in another way. The physical education teacher chooses how closely to follow detailed instruction, reinforcements, and assessments. The detail is there for those who wish, but experience and professional preference, as long as staying true to the instructional content aligned to assessment, if that's a desired goal, is there as well. I want to spend a little bit more time on the assessments and grade level benchmarks. The EPIC assessments measure learner progress progress on the steps in the teaching learning progression in relation to the clearly stated grade level benchmarks at K-5. EPIC Classic is one of the few, perhaps only, comprehensive K-5 physical education curriculums to provide instruction sequenced to achieve targeted grade level outcomes. I don't say that to place EPIC in a higher position than any other resource, but just to acknowledge that grade level outcomes are a way of assisting teachers in showing outcomes for their program and in showing accountability. It's easy for EPIC users to demonstrate grade level outcomes and to show learner achievement. I also want to emphasize the importance of embedded assessment. You don't have to set aside a specific lesson for assessment. You can do it during practice, during reinforcing activities. You can record student performance on the recording sheet, calculate the rubric score, which in the EPIC assessment rubric we give both a 4-point and a 5-point option. You can calculate the rubric score based on the number of elements mastered at a later time. Or I think it's very interesting to consider asking students to calculate the score themselves when math competencies or course standards align with that at that grade level. And speaking of cross-curricular content, there are many, many cross-curricular opportunities with EPIC Classic. I've illustrated how EPIC takes the burden off of physical education programs regarding alignment of program objectives, instruction, practice, and assessments. Let me turn to a brief mention of the EPIC 612 Lifetime Activity Modules, which build on elementary content using the same spiral curriculum design that is powerful at the lower grades. And in this case, the 612 resistance training module, learners are introduced to the content and process to compute their one repetition maximum training load after determining their own personal strength training goal. The critical thinking skills of data gathering, analysis, and synthesis, and the mathematical computations involved provide a real-world experience and, I would say, incentive to learners. The knowledge and skill to determine now transfers into lifelong knowledge and skill. This is just a tiny example of how the wealth of information provided in EPIC Lifetime Activity Modules is cross-curricular. As I mentioned, the teaching learning progressions are a compendium of information, and student planning is very soundly woven into the 612 program. And just on this particular slide, please keep in mind that weights are not transferable from one exercise to another. So while I have described a particular resource, the exemplary physical education curriculum, EPIC, teachers everywhere are drawing on the World Wide Web to inspire themselves to gather resources, to guide students in their own learning process. As we know, open education resources, massive open online courses are a contemporary phenomena. People of all ages and circumstances make choices on why, how, and how much physical activity they will bring into their lives. We need relevant, satisfying physical education that supports the development of confidence and knowledge that undergirds physical activity over the lifespan. I will mention that EPIC updates are underway to help meet needs. Soon, downloadable K-5 individual objectives will be available. It's now possible to obtain any K-5 objective individually in hard copy, or of course all 35 if interest is in a comprehensive elementary program for physical literacy. It is also possible now to obtain just the 612 user manual and other projects are underway. And while it's too soon to announce these, let me know if you would like information as soon as that is available. And I'd just like to close my presentation by acknowledging that as we look to the future, our ultimate vision needs to stay strong. And I'm proposing that vision to be that all of our children have the benefit of optimum growth, development, and healthy lives, and that effective physical education for the 21st century remain a cornerstone to achieving that vision. And I'll thank you all.
Thank you, Lee. And if anyone has questions for Lee, they could start posting those in the question box on the GoToMeeting control panel. At this point, I'd like to turn it back to Steve to tell us where we're headed with the future of physical education.
Thank you. Well, as some of you know, for the past few years, I've spent quite a bit of time studying and talking and writing about and anticipating how the physical education profession might change and look in the future. And so today, in the limited time I have, I want to make 3 observations and briefly address each one of them. First, the way in which we educate people is changing. Second, innovation in the fields of science, medicine, and technology continue to accelerate. And third, physical education, as I mentioned earlier, is different from physical activity. Thinking about the future is, of course, not very new. There was a lot of professional interest back in the 1980s.
I'm sorry. Did I throw you off, Steve? I apologize. Oops.
Yeah, that's the one.
Great.
And back in the 1980s, 2 very well-known physical education scholars, Larry Locke and Pat Dodds, suggested that the question facing us was not so much what is the future of physical education, but rather, is there a future for physical education? And over the past few years, as you know, I've spent quite a bit of time with the PE 2020 initiative, in which we also looked at what people were thinking about in terms of the purpose of physical education. With Larry Locke, also about the same time, as you can see from this quote, Darrell Siedentop was similarly pessimistic in his assessment of secondary physical education, fearing that in fact we could be extinct, at least at the secondary level. The good news, of course, is that 30 years later, physical education at all levels continues. And yes, there have been some program and position cuts, but also there have been and are some examples of exemplary programs, and in some places increases in the time devoted to physical education. So looking ahead, what's on or perhaps over the horizon? Something that we need to better appreciate is that physical education isn't simply a world of its own, but rather exists within the much larger world. And it's easy to forget this as we debate and argue back and forth about best practices in physical education, ideal curriculums, what we should be doing, and we overlook the fact that it's as important, or perhaps more important, that we need to be viewed relevant to the world outside of physical education. Otherwise, what we think is meaningless. And our relationship with public education demands close attention because our existence depends on us being included in public education curricula. What we know is public education hasn't changed much since it was created toward the end of the 19th century. Next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, thank you. Typically, children are grouped together by age They travel daily to school buildings. They're assigned to a schedule based primarily on organizational convenience rather than individual needs. And all of this takes place according to a carefully regulated seasonal timetable. We all know that this is not the best way to educate children. Every child has unique educational needs, and whole group instruction is very ineffective. We waste huge amounts of time delivering this type of education. Well, things are changing in education, and faster than most of us probably appreciate. And as the ways in which education is delivered change, it's going to affect how we deliver physical education. For example, we're used to having children attend compulsory physical education in large groups at regularly scheduled times. As schools move to individualize academic instruction, what will be the consequences for physical education? Individualized education is coming, and physical education needs to prepare itself. Let's consider another change that's going to affect physical education. Innovation and change in technology, science, and medicine is going to solve many of the difficult challenges we'll be facing tomorrow. And it's also going to change physical education in ways we may not be anticipating. Next slide.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go on. Today, the main role for teachers is preparing and delivering instruction, observing and recording student performance, and giving feedback to help learners improve. This is an extremely difficult job, as we all know. How can one person adequately address the learning needs of a group of 30 or sometimes more students? But what we're starting to see is that technology can do things that we never thought would be possible, such as when the IBM computer named Watson beat the very best humans on Earth at the game of Jeopardy. Next slide. Today, our students carry cell phones with computers more powerful than mainframe computers of a few years ago. And they've become multifunctional devices. It's very easy to anticipate that technology will soon be available that can individualize instruction in all subject areas, including physical education, far more efficiently, accurately, and faster than human teachers. What will this mean for physical education? And while I'm not saying there'll no longer be a role for physical education teachers, it's going to have to be a different role, and certainly one that we should think about and prepare ourselves for today. The third observation I'll make about the future relates to the increased public interest in promoting children's physical activity. This has been spurred by worsening obesity and the negative health consequences and the projected economic cost to the nation. None of us would disagree that children will lead more productive and enjoyable lives if they're physically active. But how can this best be achieved? Next slide. Outsourcing physical education is increasing. Around the country, the YMCA is expanding its programs to provide physical activity to schools, and there are companies such as the one illustrated on this slide based in California contracting to provide physical activity in our public schools. Next slide. When I earlier shared thoughts about the importance of physical education, I suggested that we need to strengthen our efforts to communicate physical education's unique value. You know, it's great when schools want to get their kids more physically active, but it should worry us that they may be willing to replace physical education classes and physical education teachers with physical activity programs. In 2011, saving $250,000, a school district in my state of Washington contracted with the local YMCA to teach its physical education classes. Next slide. If this trend continues, there's a very real possibility that it's going to gain momentum until it reaches a tipping point. And school districts nationwide, recognizing the financial savings, completely eliminate physical education and replace it with physical activity organized by outside businesses. And probably you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, where he discussed the fact that things go on for a period of time and then suddenly something happens and it creates this tipping point where things completely change. And it worries me because were this to happen, for example, in a school district like Los Angeles or Chicago, then I could imagine this tipping point where it just falls around the whole country, where school districts recognize that they can save money through replacing physical education and physical education teachers with physical activity programs offered by outside businesses. And if this happens, there's not going to be an easy return for physical education. There's not going to be do-overs, and it will mean the end of physical education as we know it. Next slide.
Okay.
So there shouldn't be any doubt in our minds that physical education in the future isn't going to look like our grandfathers or our fathers or even our current physical education programs, that we should anticipate they are going to look very differently from how they look today. Next slide.
Well, thank you very much, Steve.
And because of this,
go ahead, please.
Should be one more slide.
I think we already showed it. I apologize. Close with your Gretzky quote.
Okay. It would be some technology. Yeah, I get it's not improving quite as fast as I said. It will be smart for us, I think, to spend some time anticipating and preparing for where our profession is headed. Many people have said the best way to predict the future is to create it yourself, which I think is good advice, and that we need to be thinking about this as to where we are going in our profession. And as you can see from this final slide, Wayne Gretzky maybe put it even more succinctly than I can express it. So thank you. There are at least 3 areas that I think are worthy of some consideration.
Well, Steve, we really appreciate your observation and your long perspective and your challenge for us for the future. I'm sure you've sparked a lot of conversation and thoughts in people's minds. So what I'd like to do now is open it up to folks to pose a question. You can raise your hand if you want, so we could call on you, or you can pose a question by posting it in the question box. So we'll just take a few minutes and let you compose your thoughts. We have, looks like 14 questions have come in. Let's see. Let's take a look. And I'm going to call on my colleague John Seville, who's going to help us navigate through these questions. So John, say hello if you'd like. And
hi, Martha. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Thank you.
Hi, this is John. I'm not seeing any questions on my end here, Martha. So I'm not sure if I've been enabled or not, but they're not showing up. I've made some comments to you. Did you see those?
Let's see. I'm opening them up now. Let's. Okay. Here is a question probably for Steve or Lee. When do you anticipate the change in the look in PE? And perhaps Bridget could provide a little more explanation for that particular question.
Let me give a response if that's okay.
Please do.
Is that okay, Martha?
Yes, please do. Thank you, Steve. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was fortunate to be in Singapore this past summer, and somebody asked me about, well, how do you do this in America? And it struck me as to, well, there is no one way anything happens in America, because we have 50 different states. It's like 50 different countries. And within those 50 countries, you have hundreds or thousands of school districts. So I think sometimes we anticipate that change is going to come from above, when in fact it's certainly not going to happen in the United States. That change is going to come from the ground up. And I think when we look at the exemplary practices in public school programs, they mostly haven't come from people like me in higher education. They've come from the folks out there in schools who have come up with some creative and great ideas to better serve the needs of students. So I think we really need to accept that we're responsible, each one of us, for making change, I guess in the words of Gandhi, being the change that we want to see. Right. Rather than anticipating that NASPE or AFID or any other group is going to change things for us.
And here's a related question, Steve, and I think it's probably well stated for many of the people on this call today. And what differences do we see between elementary and high school learning settings in the future? I think you've touched on that in your final session of your slides, but is there much segmentation? We know that most states do not require much in the way of high school physical education. Do we see those requirements beginning to change? There's some innovative work going on with the Illinois Board of Education to require a more brain-based approach to physical education. They are the one state that does require physical education K through 12, and it is a high school graduation requirement. So I think many states are beginning to look at what can they do with their PE investment to make sure that students stay engaged in learning and graduate with skills that will help them be healthy for a lifetime. But what other, Washington State, perhaps you could speak to that, Steve. What do you see happening in Washington State to strengthen the position of physical education, if at all?
You know, that's an excellent question. Sometimes I think we sometimes complicate. I'm going to answer it a little differently. Sometimes we complicate what we're trying to achieve, and to me, the fundamental question is I put it at an individual level, which is, if I look at one of my children or a child, and I think, what am I trying to do for this child in terms of physical education and in terms of this person becoming a physically educated individual or physically literate person? And so, to me, the key is looking at, well, if I was teaching in a school, is, well, what do the kids in my school need? And I think that's very different both around the country and different areas of the country, depending on geographical regions and climatic conditions. And it probably is very different whether it's elementary or middle or high school. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter where you are. You're trying to get each one of those children that you serve to adopt this healthy lifestyle and feel motivated to want to go out and be physically active. So to me, the challenge is, is trying to think, what do I have to do to get each one of these children to be physically active? And as I said, I think that's different depending on where you live. I don't think there's a one way to do this, and I'm pretty sure that policies and government legislation isn't going to achieve it. I think that we have to once again go back and accept we're responsible for this happening in the situation where we're teaching.
Right, and the public will, and certainly many districts have local autonomy for selecting curriculum, but certainly if it's not a graduation requirement, it gets less emphasis, and that typically is a state-related policy. I'd like to shift the focus now. We have a question here for Lee. A questioner is asking whether the updates that are being made to EPIC will include how they align with the Common Core. And Lee, I believe your microphone should be on.
Yes. Yeah, I think it is on. And yes, and I'll say that the digital downloads of the K-5 individual objectives do not. They are downloads of EPIC Classic as it exists right now. The updates we have underway, however, consider Common Core because the cross-curricular opportunity is rich. I think, building on what Steve said as well, thinking about regional needs, local needs, needs across different constituent groups, learners, students, the opportunity to weave in meaningful Common Core connections is rich, maybe particularly rich at the middle and high school levels. And speaking just about Michigan, when you think about our rich natural resources, when you think about literature that describes those resources, and as I mentioned in my one simple example, math literacy skills being applied, Common Core using the wisdom of the Bloom taxonomy and so forth is both specific to grade level and then a philosophy, I guess. And so, yes, the short answer to the viewer's question is yes.
Okay. So when the downloadable version is available, there'll be some obvious linkages then to Common Core.
Well, as I'm making a distinction here, Martha, between EPIC Classic downloadable K-5 PDFs, which are soon to be available. That's EPIC Classic, as I've been calling it throughout my presentation. That is the EPIC K-5 curriculum as it exists at this point, as it was crafted by those leaders over the years who were very focused on assessment, accountability, and student competence. Your question, Martha, was the downloadable future EPIC, the EPIC update that's coming. I'm just making a distinction between my use of the term downloadable and perhaps yours.
And the updated version. Sure, sure.
What's coming? Yes, yes.
Here's an interesting question from one of our participants that I'm just going to read so that we can get the whole gist of what they're saying. Instead of simply focusing on having the child or participant do it, are you looking at the development of the whole person and teaching them the why and the how, so they will be more educated on the process and stick with it because they have a more thorough understanding of it? I applaud the effort. What are you going to do with schools that are cutting physical activity and physical education? It's kind of a multifaceted question that I would open up to Steve and to Lee to comment on as you see fit.
Well, I think the first part of that question, the author really identifies what makes us distinct from purely physical activity organizers, that we are educating the child. And as I said, to me the key thing is we've got to get them to want to do it. And I think in the past a lot of our practices have actually discouraged kids from being physically active because we've done stuff to them that they haven't enjoyed. And I still see that today with some of the physical activity programs where we're trying to get them, all children, into gyms and doing conditioning and fitness things, which are adult. That's an adult creation. Kids don't want to do that, and some kids are okay about it. So I think the key thing that's our strength is that we are trying to address the needs of each one of the students that we teach, and we aren't going to do that with this one-size-fits-all approach. What are we going to do about programs that get cut? Well, I don't think, I'm not sure that our focus should be on that, because I think if we can create some exemplary programs, then we are going to make it evident to the public how important we are, and we would show them that if you have concerns about the health consequences of sedentary living, then we are your solution, because we can actually deliver results. So I think, to me, yes, it's sad when programs get cut, but our focus should be on creating these great programs that others find attractive, and then legislators pick up on that and they want to see them in schools.
And certainly, I think since we started Fizika, and certainly years before that, I've seen tremendous growth in research and evidence that a physically fit individual is not only better prepared for life, but they do better in school. You know, so for schools that are concerned about meeting AYP and making sure that they satisfy the requirements of No Child Left Behind are well suited to invest in quality physical education programs, because it can make a substantive difference. And I think the PE profession needs to continue to be the advocate for why quality physical education makes a difference in student learning, not just in the physical performance of the student. We have a question here from someone about how connected are you to the parks or recreation areas for after-school participation to kind of continue the learning that occurs during the physical education time and reinforces the fun aspect of physical activity. Lee, you had mentioned the rich resources.
And Martha, may I?
Please do. Jump in on that one.
Sure, yeah. I'm thinking more and more about physical education as a dispersed process or system. As I mentioned in my presentation, we all know physical education is more than a particular class or course. So what does that mean? What is dispersed physical education? Well, it may include physical activity opportunities in the classroom. Martha, you mentioned, brain research and so forth, to help with student focus and classroom management. Certainly focus and concentration appear to be in the research enhanced with activity opportunities. But I think in the question that was asked, I would emphasize before and after school, as well as during school opportunities to reinforce physical education learning that occurs perhaps in a dispersed model in addition to a designated time and place in other ways. And I do think that that's very powerful, and not only for before and after school. I think the family setting, opportunities for families and their children and youth to engage with each other around physical education is immense. That's an immense opportunity and important as well. There are other community organizations where physical activity is common, and I know here in the greater Lansing area we've heard from some of those program providers that they have an interest in physical educators being a component, the physical education content being a component, because they care about the quality of what they're providing to those involved in their program. So in keeping with what Steve has said, I believe the changing role is a likely outcome of these shifting sands. And physical educators as professionals are the appropriate leaders in the schools and perhaps in other community opportunities. I'm not denying that all educators have very full schedules. But as we look to this changing world and the availability of information everywhere and quickly, I think that becomes even more imperative that well-trained physical educators be the resource for the opportunities to learn and be successful in learning and to be able to carry that sense of self-efficacy into a lifelong physical activity opportunity, lifespan, I would say, as well.
And this, of course, relates to what was the NASB program and probably is now the AFID program of comprehensive school physical activity programs, which have physical education at the core. And I kind of view that as the same way people become musicians, that you need to have a lesson and you need to practice, and one without the other probably isn't going to be effective. And so in schools, physical education is essential for providing instruction, and then of course we need to provide physical activity opportunities for kids to practice what they've learned. And of course, as Martha said, as Lee said, that really does relate to the preparation of future physical educators and potentially a changing role for today's physical educators, which we need to address.
Yes, and I'd like to just close with this final question, which I think your presentation, Steve, really sparked. And because of the interest and focus on national health care, how can the leaders of physical education let it be known to the masses that a premier PE program can help create healthier youth and ultimately healthier adults? This concept can put less stress on our healthcare system and bring the cost of healthcare down. Is this a matter of promotion and publicity? I think that's certainly something that PE 2020 tried to take on, and the Comprehensive School Physical Activity Plan, Let's Move Active Schools, is all about putting the appropriate focus on physical education and physical activity as a way of preventing chronic diseases in many ways. So, Steve, how about if you take the last word and sum up your response to a question about how do we position PE as a solution to this broader set of problems?
Gosh, that's a question or a good point that probably needs a lot more discussion. I'll tell you a fear I have, which probably isn't the best way to finish here, which is that I don't like us suggesting that we're the solution to obesity, or that we're the solution to all these things, because frankly the evidence isn't there that we can do that. What I do like is for us to position ourselves that we have the ability and capacity to contribute to certainly those issues. I've written about this, I sometimes feel that we're headed in the wrong direction and that we've forgotten why all of us first participated in physical education programs, and it was nothing to do with academic learning, it was nothing to do with health, it was nothing to do with social relationships, it was simply the pure joy of being physically active and moving. And I think if we can recapture through what we offer and the way that we offer it, this joyfulness of being an active, physically active person, that will probably achieve those other things that I just mentioned. But the focus needs to be that we've got to make movement joyful for people, because then they'll want to do it. And once again, through that we will be a solution to healthcare and other issues.
Well, Steve, I think that's an excellent point on which to end, because that really is the answer. How do we make physical education a joyful time in a student's life so that they want to recreate that experience for a lifetime? And with that, I know that everyone on this call is very interested in continuing the discussions that we touched on tonight. So our last slide contains our email addresses and the websites where you can get more information about our work at Fizika, the Michigan Fitness Foundation, and the PE links for you, which you can get to through Stephen Jefferies' email address as well. So with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for taking time on a busy Thursday evening or afternoon to join in this very important discussion about the future of physical education. There is a future for physical education, and we all need to work to make that happen. Thank you and good night.